Okay, one last time. Hi, I'm Dr. Cooper Savage. This is Kaitlyn Neece. She is also one of our Masters in Athletic Training students. Today she'll be discussing the carbohydrate versus a protein diet and which one yields a greater sports performance for our athletes population. So, thank you.
Hey everyone, my name is Kaitlyn Neece. So like she said, I did my research on carbohydrate versus a protein-rich diet and whether that yielded a better sports performance in either field. Okay, so for my focus clinical question, I really wanted to go in depth of why this topic altogether. So with all that, in the sports community, they always want to try and get ahead and be better, and how can I get the better edge on the guy beside me? And that's kind of goes with training, but it also goes with how they fuel their body as well. And some of the fads going on is your carb loading and carb cycling versus, protein everything. And so that's kind of where I came into this research. So for my focus clinical question, it was with athletes, does a carbohydrate-rich diet or a protein-rich diet lead to greater sports performance? So with that, my population were athletes, and I put no age restriction on it. Then with the interventions, it was whether it was a carbohydrate-rich diet, which would be your carb loading and carb cycling, and then your comparison with that would be the protein-rich diet, and then what was the outcome? Did we get a better sports performance overall? So my sources of evidence, I used the JSU library, the online library that we have with Medline and Sports Discuss. I did research with just carb diets, protein diets, just in general, and then I narrowed it down to athletes that were focusing on that area of their training, not specifically fitness. And so it kind of yielded me to my inclusion and exclusion criteria. So with that, I included studies, obviously, that had protein-based diets or carb-based diets. But with that, my protein diets had to be animal-based, so it had to include meat. They had to have an active lifestyle when compared to ACSM standards, which is 30 minutes of moderate intensity 3 days a week. And then it had to be in the English language, and it had to be human participants, because in this field we like to use animals a lot. So, exclusion criteria was my sedentary lifestyle, because I needed them to be active. They had to be considered an athlete. And then participants with celiac disease, because they couldn't participate in a carb-rich diet. So the results of my search, I had 18 studies. Out of those 18, I narrowed it down to 6. In those 6 studies, I had 4 systematic reviews, a case study, and a cross-sectional study. The protein diets looked at just optimizing sports performance altogether. Then I also used a position statement from the NATA, and it talked about overall effects of just nutrition on different individuals with diabetes and then the celiac disease and things of that nature. And then the effects of a carb-rich diet on your body in general was then encompassed later. So I used the Prisma and Strobe grading scale to give me my level of evidence. And then moving on to my studies. So my study participants, it ranged from 1 individual to 18. So if you look at the Poldiger and DeVec, they only had 1 individual. He was a cyclist, and they looked at his diet that he already had, and they just changed his diet and left his training the same, just to see how that affect. Antonio, then they just did a research, so they just researched these different items, and they used studies that had a relationship between the protein intake and healthy outcomes with their body composition and sports performance. Jaeger did not have any study participants at all. It was like the nutrition and athletic performance. That one was the NATA statement, sorry. Whew. Okay. And so they just, again, researched different studies that were already out there and compiled their data there. Phillips then went on to look at the optimal protein intake with athletes, and he actually focused on renal health and was what was recommended actually what they needed to have that high sports performance. And then my last study that I looked at used registered dietitians to actually compile different plates for athletes. So for my interventions, the Nutrition and Athletic Performance statement talked about it used the Dietetics Evidence Analysis Library, and they used a range from March 2006 to November 2014. The Potiger and DeVec, they actually used a VO2 peak study. So they looked at the people's diet that they already had. So they didn't change your diet. They actually brought in people that were already focusing on either protein or a high carb or low carb diet. And so they used this testing to see which one was better for sports performance or not. Then Antonio and Yeager did not have any interventions. It was more of a observational type study, so they just kind of observed and they used questionnaires in that aspect. Phillips then went on to review just evidence on why protein and why is it the macronutrient that's responsible for hypocaloric weight loss and maintaining your lean mass. And then Reglunda-Closa used a life cycle assessment. So they actually looked and they said, okay, this is how long it takes, or this is how much energy, environmental energy it takes to make this plate. Is it worth it when it is turned into our energy? Which actually had a pretty neat outcome. And so the outcome measures and results. So the NATA statement talked about just body composition and sports performance and how that would differ. So they actually said it can't just be protein, it can't just be carbs, but it depends on the person itself. And it also talked about those special populations. The VO2 max or VO2 peak study said that a lower heart rate was found with a high carb diet, but they had to stop their moderate intensity exercise quicker with that high carb diet. And then with a low carb diet, our RPE scale was lower, but we had to stop our higher intensity period a lot quicker. So it was kind of a give and take there. Antonio then looked at just caloric deficiency. So he was the one that was talking about all this protein and how it was going to give us this great body mass, but we were lacking in our calorie intake. Yeager then talked about how he came up with that 1.4 to 2 grams of kilograms of body weight should be consumed in your protein, and so it's about 10 to 35% of your daily intake is what that should end up being, so that you can yield that higher sports performance. Phillips, it just said that protein really just equaled your lean mass, and it promotes fat loss, but that they actually said 2.5 grams per kilogram per day is what would be more acceptable for this higher sports performance. And then Reglunda-Closa looked at that higher intensity athletes should actually, they would require more protein in that aspect. So, when we look at our proteins, the clinical bottom line just said that it enhanced your body composition. You could gain weight with protein, but it would be that lean mass, and that you would optimize your sports performance in that aspect. Carbohydrates produced a lower heart rate, but it did give you a greater RPE level, and that it caused you to terminate exercise prematurely. And your optimal diet in the end would optimize your sports performance. You would then have recovery from your training, and that it actually would include those special populations, which is what we got from that NATA statement. So from the chart earlier, our strength of recommendation actually ended up being a grade 8 evidence. And what does this mean to me as an athletic trainer? How does this apply to my life? So here in rural Alabama, we don't have the capabilities to provide a dietitian or certified nutritionist to our high schools around here. And a lot of that is weighed on the athletic trainer that's there and the coaches that are around. So being able to use my interprofessional knowledge and the education that I've gained from this, I will then have somewhat of the guidance and knowledge that I need to help then prepare athletes for practice and competition in a better way than what they have now. I also can then use this in collaboration with a nutritionist, a dietitian, the physician that we have there to help with fueling this athlete properly. And that's going to give us a greater sports performance, it's going to optimize your muscle healing, and it's actually going to lessen the susceptibility to injury since we are fueling our bodies properly. And these are my references. And then I would like to take this time to thank the JSU Student Symposium for accepting my research. I would also like to thank Dr. Savage and Dr. Clark for reading this over and over and over again. And I would like to thank my colleagues for being there, their great emotional support. Any questions?
So, did they, just really interesting topics. So, the only thing I was wondering about is the type of sport performance. Do they define that? Because there's multiple, you can look at sport performance in a variety of different ways. So, do they look at like high impact? Do they look at, more strength training or anaerobic, aerobic, anything like that? Was there any differences that they looked at?
So they focused on the athlete in their field. So if it was a football player, we focused on, or an offensive lineman, we focused on, can you do your job as an offensive lineman, and can you do it better with this fuel versus that. And that's like with the cyclist. They didn't change his training at all because he was already a cyclist, he was already an athlete. They just kind of changed his diet to see how that affected his ability to do what he was already doing.
So, based on the research that you've conducted, do you have a personal preference in the way that you might lead your athletes that you work with in the future?
So based on the research, I feel like it is very individual based. There's no cookie cutter diet for one individual because this is your sport and this is what you do. It's based off of the person's metabolism. It's based off of whether they're a endurance athlete versus just a strength athlete. There's a lot of things that play into it, whether it's the climate itself. Here in Alabama, we're probably going to need to have a lot more hydration and fuel in that nature. So I'm probably going to lean more towards foods that are going to provide that assistance than if I was not here in a nice humid environment. So you have to take all of these into effect, but it did give a swayance that more carb diets are going to be better for your endurance versus your strength, and then protein vice versa. But again, there's no perfect set diet for anyone.
Thank you, and good answer. Good answer.
All right, let's thank our speaker again.